Paul Lopes has been a living historian for over 25 years in both the 17th and 18th centuries in respect to the military material culture of the periods. Over the years, Lopes has worked with both military and civilian museums on reproduction projects and research and has been able to go behind the scenes to study the inner workings of the vast collections that these sites have at their disposal that few in the general public might never see. So let's give a big hand for our speaker, Paul Lopes.
All right, God save the king. Oh, tough crowd. All right. This is a little bit different from what we normally do. My name is Paul. My camera person is Paul Clark, who is the regimental tailor for the 33rd. One of the regimental tailors. Can you hear me working?
No, it's on.
Hello. Is it working? There it is. I just like a megaphone, old school. Anyway, the lead tailor was called a cutter because he actually cut. And the other tailors would get together and kind of put the stuff together. The way it worked, I'm going to ramble because there's so many crazy things. In this part of the military, these were professionals. They joined the military for whatever reason, and you put down what you actually did in civilian life. So when they found out that you were a tailor, boy, oh boy, the tailors were usually sequestered. They were put in separate little rooms. We sat on tabletops. Basically, it was a round robin. The military issued uniforms in just a couple of sizes, and the king wanted the uniforms to basically fit like a glove. So at this point, this uniform that I'm wearing, it's a little big. You were basically issued a uniform once you got to your station. You took your uniform to the shop, and they chopped it all up and fit it to you to fit correctly. It was a big thing in all European armies for that point. And so we're going to get into more of that later. I focus what I do in what they call the material culture, which was just that. The materials that they used that were produced in the time, how they were used, why they were used, where they were sourced, for the military uniforms and for the civilians. And I'm going to say a lot because, once again, gathering thoughts. As far as the material culture is concerned, we seem to feel that the root cause of the American Revolution was piracy. And we'll get into that later. That's kind of a studied opinion and kind of not studied opinion. I'm not actually an academic, but I have read a couple books as time's gone by. So, you want to join the Army. What they did was they had recruiting parties. And the recruiting party consisted of a drummer, which he isn't here today, a recruiting sergeant, which was generally a man still active for service, but a little on in the years, but he had been with the regiment for quite a while, and a couple subordinates to help in case it got out of control. What they did was they went to backing up. This is Lord Cornwallis's regiment. We are Lieutenant Colonel Webster's division, which was his second in command. As the gentlemen moved up in the ranks, they started off being in charge of what they called companies, or what we call a Coy. And each Coy within the regiment, probably 30 to 40 men, a couple of sergeants, a couple of corporals, not much above that. You might have a captain, you might have a major as a leader during wartime, but in non-wartime, that guy was there, but you really didn't see him that much. So now you want to join the British Army because, industrial age is coming about. You might be a breeches maker. Breeches were the pants that people wore back in those days. I'm not wearing them for a reason. They were short. They had buckles at the knees. Men wore them. Boys wore them. Occasionally a lady or two. But that was the pants wear of the time. It was a huge industry worldwide, making breeches. So if I was a breeches maker and maybe my business was a little slack, I kind of got bored, I want to join the 33rd Regiment of Foot, which was Cornwallis's. I'd go downtown when I heard the drum beat and let them know that I want to join up. Now, yes, ma'am. And who are you? My name's Conception. Well, Conception, where are you from? I'm from all over. Well, Miss Conception, it's a rampant in the colonies. That was a joke. A lot of things about the British Army and about the recruiting system and everything in general is, unless you do a lot of deep research or you run across a nut like me, not that available to the winning side, sadly. So now you're going to join. So you go down, and it wasn't just a matter of take the king's shilling, you're in the army now. It was a process. You were vetted. The recruiting sergeant would stand you in a line, and he would check your physical being. They wanted guys that were basically 5'8", 5'10", slender build because of the uniform needs. You needed to be able to tear your cartridge when you got to that part of your training. So you had to have a little bit of dental going on. They would sit there and talk to you about the King's Army, and as that went on, the recruiting sergeant would walk down behind you. They would have you basically strip down to your shirt. They would take your, okay, let's back up again. The general clothing of the period was breeches. Most people had shirts and what they called a waistcoat, unless you were just really not down that road. So the sergeant would line you up, and the drummer would drum, and they would tell you all these stories about wine and pudding. The sergeant would get you down to your shirts and have your shirt untucked. He would walk down behind you and actually lift your shirt up to look for scars. Scars that were accumulated from flogging, which is something else we're going to get into after a while. There were stories of men going town to town to the recruiting parties, basically to get the king's shilling and disappear. So a way to find out if you'd been in the military before, even though civilians were flogged, was to look for scarring. So that was the first thing they did. He would check he would check your general health, ask you some questions, put down your information. Then they would go to the local magistrate and find out if you were a person of good standing, find out if you had any outstanding bills, so to speak, if there were any things about your reputation, so on and so forth. If you got cleared there, then the recruiting sergeant would go to your local clergy. Same kind of questions. Church of England or not, God-fearing man, do you see him on Sunday, so on and so forth. Then he would go to the local tavern to see if you had any outstanding bar bills, because they didn't want people in the King's Army that were not outstanding, proper people. The stories that you hear and the things that you're told through cinema, so on and so forth, shows the English soldier, especially when you get up into the Napoleonic period, shows the English soldiers as kind of the scum of the earth, and just the guys that had nothing else to do. They didn't want to go to prison. They didn't want to raise their 10 children. They didn't want to pay their bar bill, so they joined the army. That's not how it really was, at least in this period. So now it's really, really hot. So you've seen me in my uniform. That's as far as that's going to go. Once again, being a tailor, I have a little bit of leeway per se when not on the parade ground. Okay, so now all of this has been done. This process takes a good 3 or 4 days. Meanwhile, they tell you don't spend that shilling, because if you spend that shilling, you're in. So I can't remember today's equivalent of a shilling. I know that years past, a pound was up into the $3 and $4 in the convergence. American dollar an English pound. 1 pound was, I think back in the 70s, if any of you were around, $3 or $4 equivalency. So what a shilling was worth, I don't know. I just know that a lot of people went through life never having any money. So the shilling was very valuable, and it was burning a hole in the pocket of these guys that wanted to join the service. Once again, if you don't spend it, we don't get you. So that did happen. A lot of the men did go off the deep end, spend the money. They were in the military. Some didn't. And after all that vetting process, you might have 10 people wanting to join up. Out of those 10 that showed up that morning, we might take 6. Out of those 6, maybe 4 will pass the vetting process. Out of those 4, 1 might have spent the shilling, so we know we got that guy. But if the paperwork checked out for the other 3, they were in. Now, prior to the problems we were having in the colonies, you were then paraded around. They taught you some things. They taught you how to stand like a soldier. They taught you a couple of general things, and you became part of the recruitment party. And you went to the next town, and the next town, and the next town. Now, Lord Cornwallis was on the Yorkshire side of England, if I remember. A lot of my facts are going to be, don't fact test me, but because I've done this so long, sometimes I forget dates, so on and so forth. When you signed up to join the 33rd Regiment, you signed up to join the 33rd and no other regiment. It was very common in the British Army to move you around. If they needed a couple guys here, change regiments. If they needed a couple of guys here, change regiments. But not the 33rd. When you were in the 33rd, you were in for the thick of it because of the reputation. Lord Cornwallis, very wealthy man, and he was he loved his troops. Let's just put it this way. Has anyone seen The Patriot? Yeah, boy. Okay. Sadly enough, a movie with really good visuals, kind of lacking in true historical fact, at least from our side of the fight. But I love it too. I mean, I've seen it, I don't know, a million times, every time it comes on, just because of the Mel Gibson part. A great movie for basic patriotism for you guys. We're just going to stop right there, because I can go on and on. Okay, if you think about the movie, I'm going to say 2 things before you guys start throwing stuff at me. The scene in the beginning of the movie where Mel's trying to perfect the rocking chair, y'all remember that part? He sits on it, it breaks, he sits on it, there's a big old pile of rocking chairs over in the corner. The rocking chair didn't really come into existence until the 1800s, so he was way ahead of his time. The scene where the cavalry guys took the people and locked them up in that church, set the church on fire, everyone cried. That didn't happen until World War I in some obscure part of Germany. So, once again, a really good patriotic movie for your side. A fact-based give and take. It was a hodgepodge, so enough about movies. All right, so now, we've joined the military. We're in the Army now. They would take you to what they called a barracks for your basic training. And that's where they taught you to walk, talk, so on and so forth. They issued you small clothes. This is fun. These are small clothes. It was your basic undergarment, which you got an undergarment. You got a set of breeches. You got a shirt. You got a waistcoat. And you got a pair of shoes. Now, not all shoes had buckles. There you go. Something else to learn. Buckles were expensive. The average person, if they had some, lucky for them. But they did tie their shoes. The shoes were single last shoes. They didn't have a left and a right. And that went way on up into the 18th century, or 1860s. It was just cheaper to go get another shoe so you could have 2 shoes. Some shoe guy figured out, well, no, if we give them 1 for each side, they got to buy 2. Marketing. Where was I now? So now you've gone off to your beginning in the Army. The first weapon they issued you, this is going to be great, you're going to love it. You know what this is? It's really small. Do you know what this is? It's a comb. Go figure. It's not really a weapon, but it was part of your training. The hairstyles in those days for the British Army and for a lot of people, they kept the hair short in the front, short on the sides, with some length. In France, they call it a mullet. And that was the style for civilians and the military. But they wanted you to groom. That was part of being a soldier. They wanted you to look at, you were in the king's army. You weren't some rabble running around shooting at people from behind trees, unkept, not well dressed. So they basically taught you hair care. You shaved on Sundays and Wednesdays. You shaved. There was no if, and, or buts about it. If you were young and you didn't have any facial hair, it didn't matter. You shaved. Now, facial hair within this historical community I'm involved in is a very hot topic. It wasn't there. In the 1700s, facial hair was not a thing. For civilians, for the military, for the ladies, you were kept clean shaven. A beard was considered 3 days' growth. If you came into town with a beards, as we know beards, they would lock the doors. They would send the constabularies out for you because you were either a pirate, a person with mental issues, or just an undesirable. Beards were not a thing. The mindset within the hobby of, well, I'm going to be an over-the-mountain man, a backwoods frontiersman, la, 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 so I can have a beard. No, and generally no. So now, you've been issued a comb, you've been taught grooming, you've been given small clothes. This is funny. You were given stockings. Generally, now these things stretch. Generally, when you put these things on, you're going to love this. When you put these things on, they came up to here. Now, I don't know if men have ever put on ladies' stockings before, but it changes your perspective. That's where the stockings were of the time. You were issued generally 3 pair. And you'll notice we wear a lot of white. It's not that we wear white, it's that it's wool, and it's natural wool. Cotton was available. But there's a whole other story I'm going to get into about the word of cotton here later on. So you're given these long stockings, and you were given a shirt to wear. Now the shirt came down to below your knees. Yeah, small clothes once again. So even though you wore some type of drawers, the shirt came to below your knees, the stockings came up to thigh high, and without your waistcoat, you're buck naked. So that's part of the clothing myth of the period. When you were issued your uniform, again, as I do ramble, you were given a pair of shoes. You were given 3 pairs of socks. You were given 2 shoes, a pair of shoes, an additional pair of shoes, and the stuff it takes to fix a pair of shoes. Because not only tailors in the military, there were shoe cobblers, there were blacksmiths, there were gunsmiths, there were cooks. There were every walk of life that you could think of to proceed outside of the military was included in the military because you had to have that to make things work. So anyway, I'm rambling. If I get too rambling, just tell me. So now you're in the military, you've got your small clothes, you're issued all that stuff, it's put in a backpack, you're going to your basic training. And basic training lasts about 2 years. You generally didn't even see a weapon until about a year in. Because they wanted you to learn to be a soldier, to learn to stand up in battle, to learn how to take care of and take orders from your officers. Another myth, the myth that the British Army officers were very aloof and very aloof. Yeah, sure, but generally no. These guys knew that they depended on the general soldier for their life and for the support of the king. So the officers and the men had a bond. There's writings of Lord Cornwallis. His regiment was a couple of thousand guys, and we'll get into that in just a second. Lord Cornwallis actually knew his senior sergeants by name and they spent time together because he knew that if your senior sergeants were squared away, your junior sergeants would be squared away, your corporals would be squared away. Now, it's not like today's military. You didn't really have a whole lot of advancement. There was one senior sergeant per se, 70 or 80 guys, a couple lower sergeants. The corporals did all the work because they wanted to be sergeants. These NCOs were the only people that actually got a pension. The general soldier, you got out of the Army and you're out of the Army, unless you could go farther. Now, the officers bought their rank. I believe an ensign, which is technically less than a first lieutenant, because I'm just a tailor. The ensign buying into the military, about 300 pounds. Now, 300 pounds was a lot of money. So your officerships usually came from the better gentry. I'm not going to say better, but the gentry class of the British people. Generally, their relatives were officers and their relatives were officers, kind of well-educated, but they bought in. And as you went up in rank, it cost you more money. Ta-da. So that's that really quickly. Within the regiment, as I said, I'm going to ramble. I've got all kinds of show and tell here. The 33rd Regiment was broken down into what they called a hat company, and that's what I do. I hate to wear one. The hat company was your basic soldier. We had some elite type units in the regiment, grenadiers and light infantry. Now, the grenadiers were kind of a hangover from an earlier period. They literally used to throw grenades. They wore what they called a match safe, which is this crazy-looking thing here. It kept what they called slow match, which was basically to light the grenades. It was kept in here so they didn't catch themselves on fire. They didn't throw grenades anymore when we actually got into the Revolutionary War period, but they let them keep that as a badge of honor. The grenadiers were bigger, taller. Okay, backing up again. The average height, 5'8", 5'9". The average age of a soldier for a good part, 24, 25. So these aren't kids. And the older soldiers were there. They just moved on. But the grenadiers, generally 6 foot plus. They're going to wear this big bearskin helmet. Their uniforms a little more adorned. In the beginning, they did carry a sidearm. And they were the shock troops. Just think about a bunch of guys dressed like this. When they're fully on the field, they're 6'6", 6'8". Think about 100 of these guys, well-dressed, coming out of the woods and approaching you where that's what the purpose of, shock troops. So they got your attention. They kind of shock and awed you. Every military in Europe had a version of this. At the other end of the spectrum, you had the light infantry. Now, this guy's an inch or two shorter than normal. The light infantry troops were just that, small, spry guys that could move fast, guys that could shoot on the run, guys that could hide behind trees. We learned that from you. And while these guys were doing the shock and awe, these guys were coming around and they were encircling you, getting ready to get you when you took off. Basically, when you realized it was way too late, the lights would come in and clean things up. The regulars would take the field, side by side, arm in arm, as you know from Hollywood. And we were the bread and butter troops. These guys were elite. Lots of the regiments didn't have these. But since Cornwallis was so affluent, he had everybody in his army, and he loved the grenadiers. Whether or not, is your hat falling down? When we get into the Southern Campaign, which was what happens here in the South, it's speculative whether or not they actually wore their bearskins. There are some artistic renditions of the Siege of Charleston, which shows Scots Highlanders in their bearskins and in their kilts. Of course, most of the artwork is post-war. Validation, that's what we researched to find out. But that's what the Grenadiers were known for. A funny point, while we're talking of hats. This hat that I wear It's called a cocked hat. It's not a tricorn. It's not whatever. It's worn this way, basically, so there's a side. You're going to move the weapon around so it doesn't get in the way. When Johnny Burgoyne went to the Battle of Saratoga, 1777, which we got beat really bad, his basic military history was in the light infantry. Light infantry wore a helmet, really nice, really ordained, really hard to get from England. So when Burgoyne went to Saratoga, he told his entire army to take this hat, cut it up in little pieces, and turn it into this. Same hat. Same hat. That's how Burgoyne was. He wanted his guys to look like light infantry, so he made fake helmets. This is horsehair. I don't know how the horses felt about it, but it's the same hat. It takes a hat and a half to make this one from this one. Once again, the mysteries of the military. But that's what they wore. And the funny thing about it is, after the Saratoga failure, you never saw that hat again. When the troops that weren't captured or imprisoned actually got to come back to Lower America, they couldn't get this hat because it was going to have to be sent over from England. So for quite a long time, there were hundreds of guys walking around without any hats. Very sad, very sad. The hats again. When we got into the Battle of Camden, right up the road, we'll get into that. It was very, very hot. The soldiers were still wearing the wool uniforms. Now, we cut the linings out of them. Some of the coats were shortened. We did get some linen. Remember, no cotton. We did get some linen to make small clothes to help with the heat, which is a little unbearable. Where's that silly hat? All right, so this was how you wore the hat. This is great. I love this. Is my favorite part. You wore the hat like this. Now we're in Camden. We're outnumbered. Our guys are sick. Our guys are wounded. Our guys are dying. And the rebels are coming. Well, what did the soldiers do? They took this hat. They turned it completely around. They pulled the front of it down, and now their eyes are shaded. So we can see you when we shoot at you. My favorite hat. That's what they did. They adapted. They made things work. Ta-da! Well, everybody need a bathroom break or anything? Everybody good? Once again, when I do this in the field, we stay in first person. This is really a treat for me because I can tell jokes. I can cut up a little bit and not be that proper British soldier that I've been most of my life. So there we go. All right, so we've gone through small clothes. Back to small clothes, I'm sorry. So you were issued these. Now, these are a bear to put on. It's a short spat. It's a short gaiter that covers your ankle down to protect your shoes, to keep stuff from out. You were also issued a longer version of these that came up to here for the wintertime because you were wearing wool, but the lower parts of your body not protected very much. So they wanted you to be taken care of. As we got into the war, about 2 years into the war, now both sides did this in the military. The militia was different. The militia, you basically wore what you want. When you actually joined the Continental Army or the line, you were issued a version of a uniform pretty much like ours because it was the Continental Army. Ta-da. So you're responsible for all this stuff. You're responsible for the extra shoes. You're responsible for the extra shot, this shirt, the gaiters, so on and so forth. Da-da-da-da-da. The soldiers, just like today's military, I can't remember what it's called, but it belongs to the government as you do. Now, the guys would start losing this stuff, and it became a flogging offense after a while because they wanted you to look good at morning parade, which was 3 times a day. So all of a sudden, we noticed that the other side was wearing what they called overalls. It's a long pair of pants. It's already got the little thing to protect your shoes. It's already got everything you need. So if your army wore those, then the responsibility for all that other equipment isn't there. The cost isn't there. The fact that you're not going to find it on every battlefield in the world isn't there. So it was a smart move for the British Army to copy what the Americans were doing as far as what they call gaitered trousers. Now, this is kind of embarrassing. I don't know if I have to turn around. The clothing of the time, you didn't wear a waist belt. The pants were basically held up by your hip bone, so they were very high-waisted. I actually have suspenders on, which is a whole other witchcraft issue. But the pants were designed to be held up by your hip bones, so there was a lot of this in the back. So I might look like I'm wearing a diaper, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. There we go. So the point is, do these pants make my butt look big on a modern thing? But that was the clothing of the time. So we've gone off to basic training. It's really, really funny. I'm going to keep throwing stuff at you. The British Army, they kept their guns in tents. The guns had tents. Now, it was really, it's cool. It's conical. Looks kind of like a teepee. It's 6 foot across. It's 7 feet high. It's got crossbars in the middle of the pole that holds it up. It's waterproofed. You can put 15, 20 guns inside there. The men were put in tents themselves. 6 men to a tent. Okay? 6 men to a tent. The tents were 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, 7 foot high. How do you put 6 men in a tent? Well, you put them in this way. Head, tail, head, tail, head, tail, head, tail. You don't want to put your guns in there. Most of your equipment, the tents had a little section in the rear called a bell where the men could put their hats and some of their belongings, but it was 6 men to a tent. The guns were property of the king, so they were stored in the bell of arms and guarded along with the drums and stuff like that. They had all kinds of silly rules in the British, not silly, sorry. They had all kinds of rules and regulations in the British Army, all or most of all for a purpose. And George Washington saw this, and he knew about the European armies and stuff like that. So he brought in advisors to teach his army, to get them on the same page. And they started picking up all the silly rules and regulations that the British Army did. Ta-da! So in the wintertime, what are you going to do? You're going to go out on guard duty. It's going to be cold in the wintertime. So generally, for every 6 guys, you got what they called a watch cloak. For when you're on guard duty, you basically passed it off at the change of the guard. This is what they look like for the most part. We actually don't have a real original one, so we came up with this. Now, Cornwallis was so good to his men, instead of having one for every 6 guys, everybody got one. Yes, everybody got a watch cloak. They were basically carried in a sheepskin knapsack. This was the purpose of the knapsack, to put your watch cloak in. You had other stuff, but that's what it was for. As we got into the wars, we came into the South. They eliminated the sheepskin, went to a linen painted canvas knapsack, but you kept everything and you carried everything. I had so far to go. That was the basic material culture, so to speak. Your uniform was kept in proper order, so on and so forth. Where do I want to go now? You guys getting bored? Thank you. So, the British Army. So a couple things. Let's kind of drift into the modern day. I'm suppose most of you have been to Charleston. Yay. A lot of Rev War activity going on down there. Have you been to Marion Square? In front of the old, in front of the old Citadel. Now, if you go to Marion Square in front of the old Citadel, you go off to the left in front of the restaurant, and you'll see an enclosure of a piece of, looks like just a black painted rock. That's part of the hornwork. The hornwork is the defense they made for the protection of Charleston. It was made from tabby. Tabby is basically oyster shells, sand, and lime. They mixed this all stuff up. It became a composite, and they made this fort. Now, the walls to the hornwork were over 20. Now this is the relevance to an oyster shell. Okay, you know about oyster shells. The walls were over 25 feet high and 12 to 15 to 20 feet thick, made out of oyster shells. The fort itself was, I think, 300-ish feet by 300-ish feet. It was a huge thing made from oyster shells. What they did is they went over to the Ashley. They basically there was a creek. They dug a trench to connect the Ashley and the other Cooper to basically cut off the peninsula of Charleston. You think of Charleston now and you think of Charleston then wasn't very big. It was a port, import-export, but it wasn't really big in size. So what they did is they cut this trench, they built this fort to protect Charleston. Yeah, we sieged it. Yeah, it didn't really go well for you guys. But if you go down there now, the Battlefield Trust and the other entities that I truly love are coming up with a program where you go to the Hornwork and you take your phone and you put your phone on this kiosk, and it's going to show you an artist's rendition of where you're standing. You're standing kind of sort of in the middle of the Hornwork, but it's going to be on your phone, so it's only going to be about this big. Kind of took the liberty of blowing it up on my phone. Once again, this is what you're going to be seeing. The Hornwork. Get off me. The Hornwork, huge. They put the army in there. Once again, hundreds of cannons. It was a fortress. And unfortunately, there's not much of it left now. If you go to Fort Dorchester, which is up in North Charleston, that's where they kept the gunpowder. Fort Dorchester is a tabby fort, and it's in decent, very nice condition. You can get a scope of what these seashell forts look like in the Charleston area. The siege of Charleston didn't really go really well for your side. We captured 6,000 or so troops. It was different. If you were in the militia, you didn't go to prison if you were captured. They were basically, please don't fight us anymore. You're free to go. If you were a uniformed soldier with a Continental Line, a different situation. You went to a prison ship, you were sent up north, so on and so forth. Out of the 6,000 troops that were captured at the Siege of Charleston, about 1,200 of them changed sides. Hey, a lot of people don't know that. They didn't stay long, but they changed sides. Charleston was the Siege of Charleston, which is a whole other hour's worth of lectures, one of my favorite points. The worst defeat for America since the Bataan March in World War II. You guys lost more troops at Charleston than ever in the history of your military until you got all the way up to World War II. That's a fact, and I remember that every now and again. So other random social things, flogging. We talked about it earlier. You know the term, the cat is out of the bag? Yeah, boy. You were flogged for a lot of things, serious or not serious. It's just what the military did. It was a form of discipline. It was a very serious thing. If you were convicted of some crime, of course they did have capital punishment, but if you were convicted of some military type crime where you stole something, you lost half your uniform, you were drunk all the time, la 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 la, they would have a little tribunal and you would get flogged with a cat of nine tails. Now, flogging was a big deal. It lasted forever. I don't think they actually stopped flogging till like 1906. Think about that. Civilians were flogged. It was called something else. Parliament finally eliminated that, but it stayed within the military. It stayed in the Navy. If you've seen Master and Commander, which is one of my favorite movies, I want them to do a second one so bad, but Russell Crowe, there's two of them in that skin now. They're going to need another boat, bigger. But a wonderful movie, a little more hysterically accurate than a lot of the other ones that Hollywood puts out. If you want to see a really, really, really historically accurate movie concerning the British Army and how we really, really looked from the Hollywood side, 1955, The Scarlet Coat. It was Cornel Wilde. It was about the Major Arnold and his departure. But Hollywood got the uniforms better in that 1955 movie than anything since or for the future. And guys like us, the material culture guys, we drool, Look at those gator trousers, they fit just right. We have a drink. That's the kind of nerds we are. And we're really bad about seeing movies and critiquing the wardrobe department. I have a dear friend who does this in California. He worked for Hollywood. His name is Radford. He's been doing this regiment for 35 years. He knows everything. He actually took his guys to England and met the Queen, which is really not a big deal to you guys that aren't English. But it's a big thing. The material culture of what we do, there's a regiment in California, there's a regiment in South Carolina, there's an actual regiment in England. We're all the 33rd, we all look alike. We're one of the only regiments to actually have a book written about us, by us. It's called The Pattern. I'm not trying to sell it, it's hard to get. But it gives us the information to pass to you from sources that are the military. The military, you wrote a report. The report went to the next guy. He read the report. The report went to the next guy. He read the report. These reports were so fine-tuned before they were turned in that they had to be right. And when you get into the American side of your Revolutionary War, I think there's more books written about this time period than any other time period in the history of your country. And they vary. There's a lot of artistic license, so to speak, even though these are academics, even though these are people in the know, even though their sources are legitimate sources, but there's so much variance. And we see it in what we do when we go to these different places around the country, and we see their museums, and we see their signage, and we see their documentation, and then we step back and going, were we wrong? But that's just a whole other thing. But yes, the British military, as the American military does now, records were kept. The history from your side was a lot of, I'm not going to say urban legend, I'm not going to say stories, but the first person accounts of what actually happened were written by your pensioners. That's where the information for your side of the war came from pensioners that didn't get their pensions till way, way later. And a lot of the facts were written letters from home, so on and so forth. So there's a variance in history from the side of the winner. And it's all great. I really pigeonhole my research because it's such a vast topic, and I'm not an academic, so I base everything into what I know about my regiment and the Tailor part of it, and what we do versus a broad spectrum of the war. There's other people in my organization that really like the military part, and they can tell you every bullet shot, every battle fought, so on and so forth. It's just not my interest. I'm just the clothes guy, I guess. And do we have time? You guys bored yet? Okay, back to material culture. A little bit about these uniforms, and then I'll end it down. The British uniform, people say, well, why did they wear red? It's been said, well, because it hides the color of blood. Everything else is white. Not necessarily true. The red in these coats is derived from the madder root, very inexpensive root to dye the wool. It came down to cost, even though it was the King of England, even though we own most of the world. Money was still a factor. So it was madder red wool. Each of the uniforms was embellished with a facing, this red you see here. There were only 2 regiments that had red facings in the whole spectrum of the war. There was yellow, there was green, there was white, there was blue, there was dark blue, there was purple, there was lime green. That's how the regiments were distinguished in the field by the officers, so they could tell as the men were moving. The basic uniform was red. The uniform, I'm going to dabble here. The uniform had, I should know, I make these things. It had 36 buttons, 36 buttonholes. This stuff around the buttons is called lace. It's to reinforce the button. You can actually take these things apart, cross them over for the weather, so on and so forth. Going to take this to a modern state. So you've got 34 buttons. You've got 44 pieces of lace on the uniform. Each piece of lace takes 40 minutes to sew by hand. You can't sew it by machine. We've tried. All of this stuff is imported from England. The lace is about $17 a yard. There's 11 yards of lace on each uniform. The leather comes from England once again. We're working on that right now. This stuff is all very, very expensive. And it's the same people who make it now that made it back then. That's just a me thing. But the uniforms were the same and different. The little things on their shoulders just gave you a designation. As I said, they didn't really wear these hats all the time. But the uniforms were, even at that standard, even back then, the uniforms were very expensive and very ornate, but the British Army had thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And that's what we cut up and fixed. What am I missing? Oh, yeah, you were issued a blanket. Of course, it was white. Very heavy wool. It had the king's name on it because, he didn't want you to sell it to anybody else. That's what's going on. You've seen the gun. You've seen the bayonet. All right, so when you were actually issued a weapon, here we go, this is the fun part. About a year into your, even during wartime, about a year into your recruiting and your training, they issued you the Brown Bess. Now, the Brown Bess was affectionately called the Hand of the King. When you got into a wartime situation, it was always fixed bayonet. When you put the bayonet on the weapon, it became the arm of the king. Once again, in wartime theater, you had to have a fixed bayonet weapon on you all the time. If for some reason you were separated by, you're a soldier, you're in Boston, you're in New York, you're in Charleston, you're in Fuquay, Varina, North Carolina, you had to have your bayonet on you. You had to have some way to protect yourself. You had to have some way to protect the king's property. So you might be dressed like this, and you might just be carrying a bayonet because they didn't carry sidearms. They didn't carry knives. You needed a pocket knife. Generally, they were just little things, random protection, but you kept your bayonet on you most of the time. Matter of fact, you had to keep your bayonet on you all the time. You went to the firing part of your basic training. Now, the thought that they tell you that the armies lined up shoulder to shoulder and they stood there and shot at each other. You didn't have to look because you're going to hit somebody at about 1,000 yards, give or take. Yes, you might. The war broke out, and the intelligence got back to England that the colonials, the rebels, whatever, were hiding behind the trees. They were taking cover. They were shooting our guys. They were shooting our officers. They weren't gentlemen at all. And when the word got back to the military, things changed. Now, this is what you're thinking about when you're thinking about British soldiers. Arm in arm, so on and so forth. We're taking pot shots at each other. They changed all that. They had the men move to what they called open order, which gave us space. So now, if you fire en masse, there's a really good chance that 10 or 20 or 30 bullets are going to pass right between us. As the war progressed, and as our numbers diminished, because we were getting, it kind of got kind of crazy. They doubled that. It was double open order. It's still going to be a couple hundred guys, but it's going to really be, when appropriate, not between the trees, a harder target to be hit by musket fire. We actually trained our soldiers to aim. You were trained to aim at the chest of your enemy in mass fire. You were told to not flinch. You were told not to close your eyes when you fired. These things you see in the movies of guys going, not our side. You can look at the medical records of your guys' I say your guys because I am actually English, right down the street from the palace, and you'll say, "Well, Paul, where's your accent?" And it's here somewhere. It's going to be an accent joke. It comes and goes. But we were trained, skilled marksmen. We were trained not to flinch. We were trained to shoot the weapon, instantly load it, and prepare to shoot it again, whether ordered or not. We adapted the concept of taking to the tree, where we would actually take the field. Everybody. We would look for cover. We would hide. We started shooting your officers because you guys started it. That escalated the war as it got on, and especially in the South where it was guerrilla warfare. We came at you with the same tactic you came at us later on in the war. So it was not all as you see in Hollywood per se. That's pretty much it. So if you've had enough, because I can go on, any kind of questions or anything? I'm kind of running out of stuff to ramble at you. Yes, ma'am. Yes. The fashion evolved. You'll see it in modern clothing. The skinny jeans. Yeah, there you go. The fashion, like everything else, comes and goes. It evolves. There's nothing new in fashion. There's just somebody else's name on it. That's probably more opinion than fact, but being a fashionista. Speaking of. All right, so you carried a backpack. You also carried what they called a market wallet. Now, this is a Michael Kors. You can tell by the embellishment, the counterculture color of the $39.95 on eBay. I'm kidding. This was a market wallet. It was 2 compartments. You could literally put stuff in here, fruits, vegetables, twist it over like this, throw it over your shoulder, and there you go. You didn't have shopping bags, stuff like that. It was a neat thing, civilians and military. Ladies had what they called pockets, which was a really nice version of this. To put their stuff in, and somewhere in your ensemble, you had some type of. Now, the men didn't wear belts. Let's go back to that. There were no belts. The clothes were held up by your hips. Ladies' fashion, a little bit different, but they had pockets. They were somehow hidden in your thing, and they were attached with whatever's to carry your stuff. Because I don't know when the actual purse came into vogue. Once again, ladies' fashion's a whole other thing, except for the pants, the socks up to here. But yeah, the material culture, it's fascinating. Going back to what I said about piracy, during all of this, and I'm going to try to keep this short, the English moneymakers developed something they called the East India Trading Company. Very important, very powerful organization. They controlled everything worldwide. The reason they could control it was they were in cahoots with the government, with the military. So if an East India trading vessel was going to go to, say, China, India, something like that, it had some type of military vessel with it to protect it from pirates, so on and so forth. And the East India Trading Company is a whole other 50 books to read, but huge wealth involved. And that's what perpetuated what was going on. When we get to the end of the war, sure, it started not going well for us. Sure, it ended in Yorktown. Right now, the regiment and the other British forces are in Yorktown, Virginia, for a big history thing. I'm here for your big history thing, and I'm actually happy to be here. But the Army's up there in Yorktown right now. When Cornwallis left the Carolinas and moved to Yorktown for the ultimate demise, waiting on the French, there was a lot of sickness, a lot of smallpox, a lot of scarlet fever, a lot of stuff as they moved forward. And you'll see on some movies where Lord Cornwallis didn't come out to surrender his sword, and he gets a bad rep. Extremely sick gentleman. I'm not covering for him. I'm just saying he was extremely sick. And then there was a lot of pride involved. But the going through at the end of the war, going through the Virginias, the armies, the men were just getting sick as they could be. They had surgeons, they had medicine. The armies were moving so fast, it just wasn't that readily available. And it was rampant on everybody's side of the war. I don't even know where I was going with that. But yes, so now the war's over, back to piracy. What's going on with the East India Company? Opium. The big deal in India and China were the Opium Wars. Huge moneymaker, even back then. The king decided that, yes, you needed your independence. Yes, we're spending a lot of money on you guys. We need to protect the East India Trading Company. So the regiment left America and went to India to be involved in the Opium Wars. And that's where Cornwallis died. But it was all about money. It was all about people not paying their taxes. Back again, the Stamp Act, way back before the beginning of the war, Cornwallis was against the Stamp Act. Cornwallis wanted you guys to have your freedom. But of course it was, propagandaized the other direction. They didn't really want you to know that. But not the pompous but that a lot of people want you to think he was. So I'm kind of going to end it with that because being British. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. No. How do you clean wool? Wool's great. You basically aired it. You just hung it up to dry. If it was muddied or whatever, you aired it to dry and then you brushed it. It kind of came back. Now we wear these uniforms a weekend or so every now and again. They're pretty standard. But when the soldiers wore them on a day in and day out basis, they got pretty rank. If you go to museums and you actually get to be involved with an actual museum piece from this period or from the 1860 period, when the museum guys open it up, yeah, it's the same funk, and it's hundreds of years old. Now, they go through a process where they're cleaned and everything like that, but the train knows sometimes you'll get whiffs of things. I do stuff in Charleston at the museums there, and I'm lucky enough, they're really sweet with me to let me come in, and they get me involved. And the process of curing and taking care of these goods, there's a whole process to make it not smell, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it does. But yeah, the soldiers wore the same uniforms time after time. They were responsible for them. There's paperwork written of the soldiers being naked a lot when they slept, even though they had undergarments, because they slept on beds of straw a lot. And straw is very abusive to linen material. Back to the cotton. Cotton was available. Cotton was made over in India in huge quantities prior to the Revolutionary War. It was called calico. Now, we know calico as an actual print, a type of material, but a loosely made cotton fiber produced in India called calico could clothe the masses. Extremely expensive. Well, we're not going to have that. So it was actually kind of outlawed for 10 or 20 years until it was brought in. So cotton was available. It was just hidden, and nobody really knew about it. Not really used because we use linen, which was made from flax, and wool, which was made from sheep, because all the big guys in England had thousands and thousands and thousands of sheep to make wool, to sell to people. So we don't want this cotton thing to come in here that we've only got to grow to put clothes on the average person's back. So cotton a bad guy back then. But again, a whole nother book to read and study on, and I get these little things because I sit in front of the computer. Thank you. I don't have to hang out in the libraries. Any other questions? Sir, Stevie. Ireland. I forgot all about that. The Irish and the English had a weird thing. Ireland and Scotland being loyal to the king. It was all about money. When the war broke out and you were enlisted at your hometown, prior to the war, you would go to the barracks, which were north of London, to learn how to be a soldier. Most of your duty was basically going after the pirates again. There was lots of things going on where people weren't paying their bills and paying their taxes, and the army was brought in the United Kingdom and in Ireland and in Scotland to basically get the bad guys, highwaymen, pirates, so to speak, smugglers. That was the basic job of the British soldier until the war broke out. Now, when the war broke out, we didn't want to train you 20 miles from where you lived for the fact that you might back home. I don't like this. I don't like this white uniform. So they took you to pieces of Ireland to make it harder for you to leave. And you were trained in Ireland. And the British government paid the Irish government for your training. When the war broke out, our regiment was still in Ireland training for 2 years. That's where we changed as we get into the other things I talked about as far as the open tactics, the light infantry tactics. All of that was rolled into your training while you were in Ireland. A lot of things happened when you left Ireland. Let's go back really quickly to the siege of Charleston. When the fleet came from Ireland to come down to the siege of Charleston, there were literally hundreds of ships. Hundreds of ships. There were thousands of horses. Thousands of horses. Huge storms came up. We lost all the horses, sadly. Tarleton ended up in Edisto. He didn't have one horse for his, I think the cavalry regiment was 800 or 900 guys. They lost every horse. We had huge cannons on the ships. They all sunk. They all got lost. We just lost so much because the British Army's number one enemy was the British Navy. Go figure. It's the hierarchy. It's we're better than you. You're just soldiers. La la la. There was a lot of this going on in the War Department between the Navy and the Army. The Army would say we need to be here by a certain time, and the Admiralty would say, well, let's wait till December and maybe go down the Carolina coast during hurricane season and get you where you want to go. We lost a lot of the fleet. Lost a lot of the ammunition, lost a lot of the soldiers. There was one actual boat that ended up it got all the way to the Carolinas in the hurricanes, and it turned around and sent it back to Ireland. But those guys were surprised. They got there, and they're like, yeah, these people, they sound just like us. Why are we fighting them? But yeah, that happened. With our regiment, another funny point with our regiment, we got over from Ireland, we got to New York. They were doing the thing in Saratoga that I talked about before with the funny hats. One of our division, or one of our companies, got off the boat from basic soldier learning in Ireland and got on the wrong boat and went to Saratoga with Burgoyne and them and ended up getting captured and ended up missing the party. And they were gone for a year or two, and the whole time Cornwallis was going, where are those guys? You know, so that happened. That group of individuals was included with what they called the German volunteers. There was a bunch of German guys that couldn't get into their military that joined the 33rd Regiment. Most of them didn't speak English. They were composited up. They were trained in Ireland and sent. Got on the wrong boat, and they went off to Saratoga. The whole Saratoga campaign is just a folly, sadly enough. Here we go. More questions? No? Yes, ma'am. Oh, wonderful. The Hessians. Amazing. Now, they weren't mercenaries. They were professional soldiers. The thing about the Hessians, yes, they were everywhere. I've got friends that actually do the Hessian thing, and if you think what we do is expensive, the thing about the Hessians were, again, European soldiers. when it came to conquering, when it came to spoils of war, the Hessians was an open book. They could come into your community, kill you, ransack your houses, take everything you got as war booty, as prize. We weren't supposed to do that. We were told, don't do that. We got a bad rap for that sometimes happening because of the Hessians. They needed the Hessians to fight for them, but they knew because of the tradition they couldn't tell them not to pillage. So my army got a bad rap from the Hessians, who were amazing soldiers. Yeah, Trenton, they kind of got beat up. Washington was sitting in the boat when they crossed the river, just so you know. It takes 20 minutes to put these pants on. Literally, you have to sit down. You got to put your shoes on first. You've got to buckle them up. You've got to pull them all the way up this way. So it takes a long time to put on a pair of gaitered trousers. I'm assuming that the Hessians were sleeping. They were drunk. It took them a while to not only sober up, but put their clothes on. But because that was their army, we really couldn't control them per se. So yeah, they got their butts beat. But it was kind of like their fault, and good for the colonial army. A whole other thing, Trenton, a whole other thing. Any other? Once again, my regiment, 33rd Regiment of Foot, based here in Horry County. It's the premier British organization in historical, we don't call it reenacting anymore because it's hard to get the insurance. In historical interpretation or living history, this organization that I'm involved with, we are it for South Carolina. There's a whole bunch of other British people that do it in other states. We're part of the British Brigade out of Virginia and up north. The British Brigade is our sister unit for various reasons. Very serious reenactors. There are over 80 regiments in the British Brigade, each regiment having a minimum of 10 guys in it, and they're all British. Now, beauty there. In November, in Camden, we're doing a reenactment, and I'm doing a little advertising here. In November 15th, I think, without looking it up, the Battle of Camden. In Camden, it's actually in Kershaw, about 10 minutes out of town. It's the biggest Revolutionary War reenactment on the East Coast. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of us will be there. As long as, and the other side as well, guys like me, living historians, people baking bread, people making uniforms, people giving you not just the military part of the colonial period, but everything you would want to know. It's brilliant. We do stuff like this all over the country. As I said, my guys are in Yorktown right now. We do a lot of stuff in Charleston with the entities down there. Now, Horry County. I've been here forever. I've been associates. I've been friends of the museum for as long as I've lived here. I came over here in like 2000. It seems like the Army came through because we did go to Georgetown. We're involved with stuff that happened down there. And then we went to Wilmington after the problem we had with the Scots in North Carolina. Cornwallis ended up in Wilmington because we had a lot of wounded and stuff, people left over from like Guilford Courthouse. Our officer, Lieutenant Colonel Webster, wounded at Guilford Courthouse. He got to Elizabethtown where he passed away. Now, somewhere in Elizabethtown, he's buried. And we've looked and looked and looked. He was from a very, I think they might have been Presbyterian, I'm not sure. His family, he was the only military guy in his family. The rest of his family were all church folks, clergy, and so on and so forth. So he passed in Elizabethtown and was buried there. He didn't get to Wilmington where he was going to be put on ship and sent away. Cornwallis did. So it's a little urban legend. And we've been up there looking. We've gone to the various churches. They said he was, I thought, you would think, if you're a religious man and a military officer, you would possibly be interned in a church, would you not think? And that's what we think, but the I think the story behind that is he was buried on someone's plantation. So, once again, a whole nother research thing to do. But yes, so the British were in Wilmington, the British were in Georgetown, the British were in Charleston, we were in Savannah, we were all through the Carolinas. What we did was there was so much going on with the resistance movement, we built little forts. And the forts were to protect our soldiers. And the fort line goes, you can go from fort to fort to fort, all the way up, back up to New York. There was so much going on during the Revolutionary period. It lasted a long time. It really was a long war. Once again, I'm rambling. Any other questions? No. And thank you so much for coming on Football Saturday. I know that's a big sacrifice. Last night they had a football game in Brazil, and the old Brazilian guys, I don't know how to say handball in Portuguese, but it's soccer. It's football, guys. The World Cup's coming. Just remember, it's football. So that's kind of a little silly gig. Thank you again for coming. Thank you so much.